Whether you're talking about the 13 demigods created by Primus, or just any of the later bots to have held the rank, the Primes have not all been angels. Far from it. In this video, I'm going to sort the saints from the sinners and go through some of their best and some of their worst deeds. I'd like to start with G1, if I may, and Primon. The Alpha Prime, the big granddaddy, G1's first and oldest ever known Matrix bearer. Wait, does anyone else see that? He showed Hot Rod the Transformers' origins, the Autobots being consumer factory bots and the Decepticons being military bots, both of which serving the cruel quintessence. This guy was never actually named in the episode, with his name being retconned in later, so we don't know any of his deeds or background. So it's kind of hard to tell if he's a saint or sinner. Seems like a nice guy though. We do know that Primon passed the Matrix to the G1 version of Primer. This guy was one of the few consumer bots that was built with combat in mind, and was seen here fighting another bot for the Quintessence pleasure. So the bot who would be known as Primer was the first to rebel against the Quintessence, only to be killed for his troubles. From here, the Matrix went to Prime Nova, or Nova Prime. Nova Prime led the uprising that forced the cruel Quintessence to flee, which is one of the most pivotal moments in G1 history. And although no one knows what happened to the G1 version, his dark side was exposed in Transformers Devastation, who personally led the mission of Cybertronian expansion. He'd travel around on his ship, the Proud Star, with a swarm of Insecticons, cyberforming any planets they deemed suitable, including Lithone, which was this planet from Transformers 86. But this one time they were running short on supply, so they stopped off on this planet, which is rumored to have been Unicron. And so a darkness fell over the crew and their ship, causing them to become corrupt and mad. And Nova began targeting inhabited planets for cyberforming, wiping out several civilizations. One of these planets was Earth, where apparently Kranix sabotaged the ship upon approach and it crash landed, trapping its crew and resources in stasis. Not knowing what had happened to Nova Prime, the Cybertronians declared Nova Prime as missing and lauded him as one of the greatest Cybertronian heroes to ever have lived. This was similar but not really to IDW's incarnation of the character, who with his crew aboard the Ark was pulled into a portal into the dead universe and became Nemesis Prime. He even had his own equivalent of the Matrix, an anti-Matrix, called the Darkness, which ruled the dead universe. Now his plan to expand Cybertron had now evolved, and he wanted to merge the dead universe with the live universe, which obviously would mean the destruction of the live one, right? The thought that the lineage of Primes had been corrupt all along drove Optimus to renounce the title of Prime, and he became Orion Pax again. But Rodimus jumped in and actually did save the day this time, giving Optimus the pep talk he needed, also getting blasted to pieces by Nova, which prompted Orion to take up the mantle of Prime again and ram his arm right through Nemesis Prime's chest. So Nova Prime, sinner. But let's jump back to G1, where if you remember the lineage goes Primon, who passed the Matrix down to Primer, who passed it to Nova. Now nobody really knows what happened to Nova in G1, but by the time the first Great War broke out, which was when the Decepticons led by a bot called Trannis realized that now the Quintessence were gone, they could take power and rule Cybertron themselves. Anyway, by this point, Nova had been succeeded by Guardian Prime.
And they got their way.
It was under Guardian Prime's leadership that the consumer goods robots took on the name Autobots. He didn't last long though, as he was quite quickly killed by the Decepticons and passed the Matrix down to Zeta Prime. Zeta Prime didn't last long either in G1, dying under unspecified circumstances, but in other continuities, well, dark side alert. So of course he was Optimus' predecessor in the War for Cybertron game and the aligned continuity, where he was called Sentinel Zeta Prime, just to make things extra confusing. So in this continuity, Sentinel Zeta came after the original 13 Primes. He oversaw the Cybertronian expansion and the construction of the Trypticon station. Oh! But he also started to bring in the inherently discriminatory caste system, which is what prompted Megatron to rise up and overthrow the Council and start the whole war. Zeta would eventually succumb to his wounds after hours of brutal torture from Soundwave. In the IDW comics, he started out nice with good intentions and stuff, but faced with the Decepticon uprising, he figured that the only thing to do was fight fire with fire, and quickly became authoritarian and prone to outbursts of rage.
I'm done!
He eventually used the citizens of Cybertron to power his new weapon called a Vampire Ribbon to quell any dissent, and then tried to engineer a false flag operation where a bunch of his own men would die, giving him an excuse to invade the city of Nion, before Megatron blew off his head with his fusion cannon. So back to G1, when Zeta and Sentinel were two separate people, Zeta passed the Matrix down to Sentinel. It was on Sentinel's watch that the Autobots started transforming. They couldn't outfight the Decepticons, but they could out-sneak up on them and out-shove them into big holes by transforming into horned theme park trucks. This changed the course of the war, with Sentinel finally beating Trion with some weird 69 sort of jiu-jitsu bull punching and usher in what was known as the Golden Age of Cybertron. And everyone lived happily ever after. Did they? The Decepticon threat reared its head anew centuries later. And yes, they'd figured out how to transform too. And how to fly. One of this new generation of hyper-aggressive evil bots, some guy I've never heard of, called Mega something, I don't know, killed Sentinel Prime, who managed to give the Matrix to Alpha Trion for safekeeping until the emergence of the next Prime, a young librarian then known as Orion Pax. But before we move on to him, we got to talk about Sentinel as portrayed in the Bayverse, who was no saint. Sentinel was an example of what happens when you love your planet or country or whatever that little bit too much, and its restoration becomes the only thing that matters, even above the lives of innocent squishy humies and your own allies and friends. That's right, he killed Ironhide and was prepared to sacrifice you, me, and just about everyone else on this rock to see it restored. Yep, sinner! So let's jump back to Optimus, who got the Matrix from Sentinel. Many adventures ensued, then died in the 1986 movie, and passed the Matrix to Ultra Magnus, who, let's face it, sucks at the job, and passed it to Rodimus. Rodimus opened the first Galactic Olympics, led the Autobots as the Quintessence reared their ugly heads again, discovered that every Transformer in the universe could be switched off with a big lever known as the Large Switch, and many other feats of wonderful good things. Strangely enough, he found that his storylines began to revolve more and more around his predecessor, Optimus, almost as if the creators of the show realized that they'd made a huge mistake killing him off. And when approached by a colony of Cybertronians desperate for help after Decepticons invaded their planet, Rodimus,
We don't have time for this!
just blew the planet up. It'd be like getting a plumber in to unblock a sink, only to have him blow the planet. Optimus was resurrected and the story continued in The Headmasters, where Rodimus would eventually take leadership again after Optimus sacrificed himself to stabilize Vector Sigma. Rodimus eventually passed the leadership of the Autobots to Fort Max before leaving with Cup and... who was it again? I don't know. To find a new planet for the Cybertronians to call home. Yeah, basically Cybertron got all fucked up after Scorponok blew it up in a conflict over a super metal called Cybertonuron. Cybertonuron. Now, Rodimus didn't actually give Fort Max the Matrix before leaving this heartbroken kid to his lifetime of abandonment issues, so I guess Fort Max didn't actually become a Prime. So that's the lineage of Primes in G1 as I see it. So let's move on to the aligned continuity and the 13 as created by Primus. So Primer, the oldest, the wisest, the biggest, swordiest. Primer was known as the Warrior of Light, a noble being who put the well-being of Cybertron at the forefront of all he did. Now, surely this guy couldn't have a dark side, could he? Well, after the Prime's battle with Unicron, a small part of his dark essence rubbed off on them, and Primer became distant and detached from the group, becoming more suspicious of his brothers, even conducting a study categorizing them, finding that the younger the Prime, the more susceptible to darkness and chaos they would be. When Megatronus found out about the study, he attacked Primer, opening a wound that would never truly heal. Now, of course, Primer was as close to a saint as you could possibly get, but he did at least have a streak of fidelity, which was exploited and would indirectly lead to the downfall of the Primes, as we will see as we progress through this video. Let's talk about Solus Prime. Ooh, a lady! Bestowed by Primus with the skill of making stuff good, she created many a great kill machine. In fact, here's a list. But not only was she good at creating stuff, she was also very good at recognizing strengths and weaknesses in her brethren and tailoring weapons that best fit to maximize on their inherent character traits. She created all of these marvelous tools of death using her own Forge of Solus, as well as the Creation Lathe, which is apparently some kind of holographic lattice. But she was able to do all of this because of a unique cognitive system that sounds kind of like a quantum computer, allowing her unequaled parallel processing. Wait, they're saying she can multitask better than the male Transformer? Oh, for fuck. She was the first female Transformer, and all who followed were based on her template, and apparently gifted with a similar processing architecture, which is the main difference between female and male Transformers also boob. She didn't just create weapons though, with many accounts of her creating artwork and music and scientific devices to aid in the Prime's quest to understand the universe and create the greatest of civilizations. She created a holochamber for the Primes to run simulations to practice their strategies for the upcoming battle with Unicron. She first befriended Megatronus as he asked her to create a suit of armor out of dark energon for him. From here, the two slowly became closer and eventually fell in love and became a lovely couple. Growing frustrated that their battle simulation showed an ever-increasing risk of failure, Megatronus persuaded Solus to create possibly the most powerful weapon to ever have existed in the history of whatever, the Requiem Blaster. Liege Maximo, who we will definitely come back to soon, was quick to point out that Megatronus was too moody to be trusted with a weapon of such devastating power and cultivated the feelings of mistrust that had been growing between the Brotherhood. A mistrust that would eventually lead to Primer calling a vote on the Requiem Blaster and Solus voting against Megatronus' wishes to keep the weapon. This then triggered the argument between the two that would result in Megatronus accidentally killing her with the Requiem Blaster. Her spark seeped into the core of Cybertron and formed the Well of Sparks, which would spew millions of life forms into existence. So apart from liking the bad boys, Solus didn't really have that much of a dark side, as her intentions were ultimately always good. But she did create a number of weapons of mass destruction, which would continue to cause chaos for millennia to come. All the same, I'm saying, Saint! But now let's look at Vector Prime, the second of the Primes to be created. The clockwork-covered old boy who is reportedly 9 billion years old was appointed Primus' guardian of space and time, wielding the Blades of Time, which would allow him to travel across the dimensions. He was also able to create temporal paradoxes, but also charged with their prevention. Now, I don't know how much of that was retconned out when Hasbro decided that them being multiversal entities created more problems than it was worth, but hey, it still sounds cool. He was known to hold the group together, always finding a diplomatic solution when division arose, but obviously couldn't in the face of the Solus killing. In fact, barely being able to contain his disgust when he found out that Liege Maximo had been scheming to turn Megatronus and Solus against each other. In the aftermath, he used the Blades of Time to create a pocket dimension for himself and retreated there, not again being seen until Optimus reassembled the Blades of Time and stepped into the pocket dimension to get Vector's aid. In the Cybertron cartoon and Fun Publications comics, he sat on the sidelines watching the various battles of the Transformers in the Civil War, intervening only when absolutely necessary, like when Primus failed to lock Unicron's spirit into the body of a newborn star, resulting in the star collapsing and forming a black hole, which came to be known as the Unicron Singularity. Vector traveled into the future to see the outcome of the Unicron Singularity, but came to a point that he couldn't see beyond. The endless nothingness that he saw was a strong indication that the Singularity would obliterate all of existence. So Vector traveled back to Earth to help the Autobots in finding a series of artifacts that could destroy the black hole. He eventually sacrificed himself to get the Autobots back to Cybertron after they had become stranded on Gigantion. Basically, he used the last of his energy to rewind time, and once his energy was up, he dissolved into a cloud of green fizz. He did explain that a version of himself would always exist outside of time though, but now he could no longer enter the linear universe, but would always be there for the Autobots in their time of need, kind of like a Force ghost I guess, and he was last seen battling with Galvatron in some sort of afterlife. The 8th Prime to be made by Primus was Onyx Prime. Fierce, powerful, the first Transformer ever to possess a beast mode. It's stated that as one of the middle siblings to be created, he had a more balanced character, with his yin and yang in perfect harmony. He embraced the spiritual side of life as a counterbalance to his more violent side. He was given the triptych mask by Primus, a mask that's split into 3 faces, that gives him near otherworldly abilities. Each section of the mask has its own name. The top piece is called Farsight and allows him to see anywhere and anywhen in the universe and timeline. The second part of the mask, called Predator, could give him a connection with any creature to give him the insight to hunt it. And the bottom part of the mask gave him Spark Sight, which allowed him to follow the journey of a spark through the Afterspark and across the hidden realms of death. He was even portrayed as a shepherd, as a literal shepherd in IDW's 2005 continuity, where all of the Primes were tribal leaders more than anything else, and he was seen taking care of lost beast formers and trying to find energon to feed them like in a little miniature baby bottle to nurse them back to health, until Shockwave turned up, that is, and blew him to smithereens. In Cyberverse, he was the original owner of the Cortex helm, coveted by Tarn, who would use it to control all of the Decepticons. One of the interesting things about Onyx was the discussion about whether he's meant to have 2 legs or 4 legs. In his brief appearance in Transformers Prime, he looked like this, but he's often portrayed as bipedal too. IDW did make a fix here though, saying that the real Onyx was a centaur, whereas once he was replaced by Shockwave, he only had 2 legs. But no, apparently they reckon that the 4 legs was the only facet of Onyx's appearance that Shockwave wasn't able to replicate. But it doesn't get any more saintly than Megatronus Prime, 5th created, 1st of the Minicons. He was pretty balanced too, having a strong sense of conscience and empathy at the center of his being. He was fairly innocent in nature, physically the smallest, but his ability to draw on a vast well of energy as well as his instinctive brain smarts made him pretty formidable and could augment the power of the other primes using the Chimera Stone. For example, amplifying Solus's hammer blows to cataclysmic proportions. And in the Covenant of Primus, he eventually accompanied his close friend Onyx as he decided to lay down his life beside Solus. Because friends!
Humans are our friends, not our playthings.
But in 2015 Robots in Disguise, he served as mentor to Optimus Prime after he died and went to the realm of the Primes. And there he kind of suggested letting a bunch of humans die, kinda? He was trying to prove to Optimus that he was always going to have to face difficult decisions and to focus on the main goal rather than be distracted by the deaths of a few humans. In the IDW continuity, he fled Cybertron to colonize his own planet and populate it with a whole civilization of minicons. But Sentinel later claimed that he abandoned his people in their hour of greatest need, buggering off somewhere via space bridge, allowing the whole population to be massacred by the Black Bloc Consortium. And that's not even the worst thing. Apparently 7 million years ago, he created his own micro-universe and went to live in it, but was also responsible for the near destruction of said universe, as his body somehow created an entropy storm that threatened to wipe out that whole universe. I don't know. That last one sounds like something he wouldn't have done on purpose. I mean, it's just something that happened. I think he was just kind of like floating around in space and then... Okay, next, there was the gentle and even-tempered Alchemist Prime, who had the ability to transmute metals and temporarily alter the properties of any object. Created with a deep connection to the natural elements and inherently in tune with all of creation, he wields the Lenses, an artifact that's permanently affixed to his face, which can allow him to perceive the physical and spiritual cycles of the universe. After the ugly events surrounding Solus's death, he chose to stay on Cybertron to help the fledgling society find its feet. He eventually disappeared altogether, although he is rumored to live amongst the population, hiding in plain sight as McAdam, the owner of McAdam's Bar. Not many vices to talk about here though, but in IDW, he was a bit of a drinker, prone to frequent bouts of inebriation. So, you know, he probably got into a few bar fights, probably a bunch of drunken texting, you know, the usual stuff. He was also seen in Earthrise, apparently, his dead body floating around the dead universe, so I'm saying he drank himself to death, yeah. Let's go with that. Then we had Amalgamus Prime, who was basically a shapeshifter, like a proper shapeshifter, like Odo. And this was due to him having the first iteration of a transformation cog. He provided the blueprint of this to the Well of Sparks created by the death of Solus, which gave any Cybertronian born from it the gift of transformation, but to a lesser degree than what he had himself. It seems like he had a pretty good nature, this guy, but you know, what wouldn't you do? Like, you're not telling me he didn't, you know, shift into some kinky shit. Alright, next, let's do Nexus Prime, the first combiner and killer of multiversal entities. He took some of Solus's greatest and most destructive weapons and combined them into his body, before splitting into 5 smaller bots and scattering across the galaxy. He did this so that they wouldn't fall into the wrong hands, of course, and only recombined when Optimus needed him most. But even then, he refused to kill any Decepticons. Saint. But in IDW, where else, he became kind of power drunk, coming to believe that the Primes were lords and masters and should be treated as such by everyone below them. He was never ever at ease around Onyx's beast formers, which is kind of weird because he would later use the Enigma of Combination to fuse beast formers with bipedal transformers to take advantage of the beast formers' raw power, I guess. But a little bit of hypocrisy there. This was until Galvatron came along, decided the whole thing was disgusting, and put all of the headmasters to death. Galvatron then hunted Nexus himself down and murdered him, too, in a rare occurrence of a Prime being murdered by a lowborn, a notion that caused many other Primes to flee the planet in fear of uprising. So this is a version of the character that was like, oh, I don't like beast formers, but then was like, oh, actually they're pretty powerful, I want to be its head. And loads of innocent beast formers died as a result. He also strengthened the divide between universes to make it so that the Primes were no longer multiversal, and that each universe had their own version of any particular Prime. I think this was done to simplify the Transformers multiverse mess, but actually it just made it more complicated. Thanks, Nexus. Plotter, schemer, Aphrodite? Okay, we'll come back to that. The 11th member to be created, he was created as one of the strategists of the group. Wait, whoa, what the? But clearly spent most of his time plotting and scheming against his brothers rather than Unicron. He has been known as the Great Betrayer and the Prime of Lies. He was said to be naturally charming, a charming that he used to spin elaborate stories to regale and entertain, but also to be used as a power of persuasion. And he used his silver tongue to be all like, to turn Megatronus against Primer,
And everybody else.
Primer against Megatronus,
And everybody else.
but no one against Solus? Maybe he was in love with Solus. He was ultimately ripped to pieces and had his head destroyed by the Requiem Blaster, which I guess was a fitting fate, as although he didn't pull the trigger himself, it was his doing that led to the ultimate destruction of the original Covenant. In IDW's primitive age, he murdered Imperator Maximo and Praetus Maximo to take leadership of an army that would become known as the Maximals. He formed an alliance with Onyx Prime, who was of course Shockwave in disguise, with Maximo allowing Onyx control over his bestial horde in return for things like a psychic barrier to stop his mind getting read by telepaths. After being tried for his crimes and imprisoned in his Titan, he was accidentally resurrected by Windblade and vowed to destroy Cybertron in retaliation for the death of his Titan Villigam. He reforged his alliance with Onyx, whose true identity was now revealed as Shockwave, and slaughtered most of RC's troops. He spent time in ancient Greece, where Liege had this female avatar made of holomatter, which was spotted appearing out of the sea in a giant shell, which of course spawned the myth of Aphrodite. And honestly, I can't tell if this is serious or not. But there's also another version of Liege Maximo, this guy, in Marvel's Gen 2 comic, which was the source of the Decepticons, and probably all of the evil in the universe, probably. I mean, look at this guy, look at this Malbogia looking guy, who was hell-bent on returning to the divine origins of the Transformers race, and constructed a vast array between a multitude of planets, called the Hub, which was this colossal resonating structure that would somehow allow him to ascend into the realm of the gods. Now, I'm not sure if this iteration of the character was ever technically a Prime or not, but overall, the character is most definitely
A sinner.
However, as recounted in Ask Vector Prime, in a Splinter timeline, this guy actually battled Unicron, leading an army against Unicron and battling him on the astral plane, and eventually giving his spark to save reality. The 10th Prime to be created was Quintus, a keenly minded and highly intelligent strategist and scientist who believed life to be sacred above all else. He wielded the Ember Stone, which is capable of reformulating the matter of the universe to create and seed a plethora of life forms in vast quantities, as well as accelerating the process of evolution in species. After the Primes defeated Unicron, he worked with Liege Maximo and Megatronus in creating their own race of robots, which made Primer deeply suspicious, probably because of the three involved were the younger Primes and, according to his study, sus AF. But this of course led to the schism and the catalyst of the eventual downfall of the 13. Quintus also featured in Earthspark, where the Emberstone was used to create Twitch and Thrash, and a new branch off of the Cybertronian race called Terrans, which would later come to include Hashtag, Jawbreaker, and Nightshade. Wait, Hashtag? What? Really? What's next? A bot called TikTok or Skibbity? Anyway, Quintus loved creating life, so he's all good, right? Well, because he created these guys, the manipulative, cruel, but also cowardly Quintessons. And whilst you can't blame the creator for the actions of their creations, the universe would have been so much better off if he just hadn't. Like, also, if Vector Prime can see the future, couldn't you have given Quintus a little nudge, like say, hey buddy, you know those horrible four-faced monstrosities you're about to unleash? There's a couple of things you might want to know. But aside from this little faux pas, sacked. Now let's talk about Custodian of History Alpha Trion, who in G1, whilst he did hold the Matrix for a little while, only did so for safekeeping, and was never actually himself a Prime, being more of a mentor and a guide to the younger bots. He was one of Primus's 13 in the Aligned continuity, where he was the third created after Prime and Vector, and he was gifted an unparalleled clarity of thought, as well as the ability to remember everything and anything, and he made it his mission to pass down as much knowledge as possible to a young Orion Pax. After Megatron and Prime left for Earth, Alpha Trion stayed on Cybertron with the Wreckers and Dinobots to combat the forces of Shockwave. At one point, he was taken prisoner by Shockwave and a swarm of Insecticons, Shockwave hoping to use the power of the last Prime on Cybertron to access the knowledge of Vector Sigma and create a Decepticon matrix. Trion wouldn't give him access though, so Shockwave resorted to pumping Vector Sigma with Dark Energon, which didn't work either, just alerted the Quintessons to the situation and brought them into the mix. Invasion! Quintesson invasion! But the point is that this guy wouldn't give up access to Vector Sigma no matter what, even at one point resorting to a suicide mission to blow up his beloved Hall of Records to prevent the information from falling into Quintesson hands. So basically, wise like a god, kind like a Santa. And so we're at number 12, and Megatronus, the youngest of the primes. Who, yep, you'd be right in thinking we should slap the Sinner tag on straight away. But is he all bad? I mean, sure, he promised Steeljaw the Earth in 2015 RID, then wanted to fuse Unicron's anti-spark with the Allspark, destroying not just the Earth, but Cybertron as well. He went on a brutal campaign of conquest in the IDW continuity, slaughtering and subjugating many an alien race, and cut Primer in half, his own brother. Oh no, wait, in this continuity they weren't brothers. Continuity confusion. He of course wanted to destroy our sun in Revenge of the Fallen, and in those comics, he came to believe that he was the Allspark's chosen one, and that his brothers were expendable. He traveled from world to world, committing mass murder after mass murder, assimilating various technologies from races, and then leaving nothing but dead planets behind. Apparently, he absorbed the mental mass of a hive intelligence 70 trillion strong, probed the neural functions of creatures that swim in probed the neural functions of creatures that swim in unrefined... Okay. All of which amplified his already devastating powers, before finally turning on the other primes and using his dark powers to kill them one by one. Shattered Glass's version of the Fallen, instead of being constantly burning with the fires of Unicron, was a sort of ice creature with only Sunstorm to keep him warm. I thought that was pretty funny. So yes, Megatronus was no doubt the worst of the worst, but you can't help but wonder if this moment hadn't happened, many lives in many multiverses would have been spared. But there was a mysterious 13th Prime too, who turned out to be Optimus, who also had moments of being far from a saint. Now, I won't go into everything because it probably deserves its own video, but when he was working for Zeta Prime as chief of security, he once succumbed to their police brutality methods and beat Swindle half to death in front of a crowd of onlookers. Not sure if that counts because it was before he was Prime, but still. He also tortured Megatron at one point using a voltage harness, electrocuting him to the point of near death, and the other Autobots had to tell him to stop. Of course, there's all the times he saw the red mist in the Bayverse. He's made quite a few questionable decisions over the years. He's got a dark, evil mirror version of himself and was brainwashed by Quintessa, after which he killed 2 Knights of Cybertron and plucked Bumblebee's wings off. And look, this really deserves its own video. I'm just not sure when I'm going to get around to it. But just given all this guy has done and all this guy has given, there's no way that he's anything but... Okay, so that was the 13 from the Aligned continuity. As I mentioned already, IDW's continuity did things slightly differently, having Primer and Nexus and Quintus and Co. not as demigods, but as tribal leaders on Cybertron. And Primus himself, the first ever Transformer, and the first of 5 bots who were known as the Guiding Hand. Primus was obviously the life giver, so, you know, saint. Simple. He would forget his entire identity for reasons we'll go into in a second, and it would turn out that he was in plain sight the whole time, and he was right in front of us as humble bot Rung. Adaptus, who would eventually turn out to be the equivalent of the Megatronus of the group. He didn't want Cybertron to stagnate and proposed the civilization expand into the galaxy, conquering all the enemies and bathing themselves in their blood, probably. When the others opposed, he started the God War, then unleashed a mind wipe that made everyone forget who they were. He blamed everything that he did on his brother Mortillus, we'll come back to him in a sec, and then when he reappeared in the modern age, he took over Farmer's body and committed many an atrocity, IDW style, which all culminated in him building a God Gun out of 5 duplicate versions of Cybertron. I've spoken about this thing before, but basically he realized that Cybertron could reflect and channel and amplify light into a devastating beam of power. He basically turned it into the Death Star. He then realized, wow, how about 5 Death Stars? Then he created like a mold, like a thing that you make cakes with to make other copies of Death Stars. And then he got rid of the mold. That became a planet called the Necro World. I mean, he went to quite some lengths, didn't he? And tried to bring Unicron, or an evil version of Primus, into our universe.
Sinner.
Solus was wisdom incarnate. After forgetting his true identity, he became Tyrist and made the laws that rule-loving bots like Ultra Magnus live by. He covered up the true Ultra Magnus's death to keep his legend alive, with an imposter in a Magnus suit. And he bled the Matrix dry to officially create new lives, then felt guilty about it, so started drilling holes in himself in a form of self-flagellation. He also drilled holes straight into his brain. Then he created a universal kill switch to eliminate every Matrix-born spark in the cosmos. It was basically like the big switch again, remember that? There's more, but I think you get the picture. This guy went off the rails in a pretty bad way, and he and Adaptus ended up killing each other, winding up just a pile of inert Sentio Metallico. Optimus was knowledge incarnate. So after surviving the God War, he left Cybertron and found the planet Kyaleta, inhabited by an advanced and enigmatic race of organic beings known as the Omega Guardians. He studied alongside them for many years, and knowledge became the only thing important to him. So he completely did away with his physical body until only his brain, which was like this orb of information, remained. It became known as the Magnificence, the largest collection of knowledge in the universe. And long story short, it got crushed by Nickel. Then we had Mortulus, who was in effect death itself. He also forgot who he was and became a humble clerk in charge of recording deaths, not only on Cybertron, but he could also teleport around to record every fatality in the universe. His story was kind of complicated, involving time travel and dark universe duplicates, so let's just say he was kind of in a grey area, ultimately good, but with flaws. And jumping to the end of his story, he was horribly butchered by the DJD. There was another version of the Primes called the Covenant. Not the Covenant of Primus, but the other Covenant. Now, I'd never heard of these guys before starting to research this video, but as far as I understand, these were the first ever versions of the Primes, and they were part of the Beast era. And Primus seeded these dudes on a secluded moon and charged them with watching over their younger cousins, the Transformers, while staying out of the limelight. For some reason, they all had zodiac themes, like the first one to be created was called Leonicus, then you had Ariex, Geminator, Cansix, Virgol, Libras, and so forth. And they would go on to fight Shockeran, who killed a number of the Covenant before the remaining members converted themselves into pure energy and battled his dark essence from within his body, killed him to death, and their purpose fulfilled, they disappeared back into myth and obscurity. Alright, you guys, let's leave that there for now. Let me know if I've missed any of the Primes. Next up, I'm going to go through every single Titan in the Transformers universe. Or I might do Transformers factions, I'm not sure, but that's going to be a monster. So until then, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you very soon for the next one. Cheerio, bye!